So I've spent an embarrassing amount of time the last few weeks writing an essay on the topic of work. And I've dreaded making the accompanying video for it for like a whole week, and it's got me really down and depressed. And the reason I dread it is because I think I dread putting my words and face to the things I scribed. I mean, when you're just writing things down, it's kind of one step removed from you. But when you also say it, I think then it becomes something you must hold yourself accountable to. In William Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony says, "The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones." But I believe this to be the opposite in reality. I think that the evil that people do terminates after their demise, but the good continues to live on and proliferate to do more good. Perhaps only simply because it is more practical and pleasant to recall the good than it is to dwell on the evil. And I believe the primary way in which we do good in the world is through our work. All wise men seem to know this. William James said, "The greatest use of one's life is to spend it working on something that will outlast it," or something along those lines. I've always had an intuitive feeling that work is something serious and it should be approached severely. However, in the, society I grew up, or the circumstances that shaped me, work was primarily preached as an instrument, It was instrumental to get the other things of real value. Commonly, I like to call it the big three. I think the three biggest reasons we worked, I would categorize as: we worked for money. In order to get money, we worked out of necessity, or we worked for a future payoff. Work, at least to me, was seldom preached as an end itself, like something noble to do for its own sake. And at first I believed this as well. I even made career pivots as a result. I really wanted to be a lawyer. I was into politics, but then I got scared that I wouldn't easily get a lucrative position, so I abandoned the idea and pursued computer science and became a software engineer. But yeah, somewhere along the line I realized that these reasons for working didn't make sense. I just could never resolve the tension of spending the greater part of one's life engaged in work and actually being indifferent to the work itself, to merely see it as an instrument. This made no sense to me. And others' frameworks and methods failed utterly in giving me the answers and satisfaction I sought. So the last few weeks, I gave myself the total liberty to create my own custom philosophy with regards to work. Besides a philosophical speculation, I also have a personal stake in the matter, which is, to my own perplexity and my family's dismay, I haven't worked for 3 years now. And at first I thought it was a simple case of burnout and, the urge would resurface to enter the same workforce again. But now I've concluded it will never resurface the same way again. So as I said, I gave myself these past 3 weeks to really deeply think about my philosophy, my beliefs and values towards work, and get clear on it so that I can follow it for the rest of my days, rest of my short or long or medium length days on this earth. I also wanted to write this essay to serve as a reminder for myself whenever my internal compass falters, as it will sometimes inevitably. So I'm not going to reiterate all the stuff I said in my essay, but just some of the main points. Okay, so I think it's not controversial. I think it's a fact of modern life now, and maybe quite for some time now, that we ascribe drudgery to labor. But despite its negative connotations, we still work because we must. We have to work. It's not in our hands. As I stated, the common reasons for this is we have to for money, out of necessity, for a future payoff. These reasons never made sense to me once fully thought out. They weren't rational, but more importantly, they weren't like the recipe for a good life. If the majority of life is spent in laboring and we labor for those reasons, it doesn't seem like much of a high quality of existence or life. And we have one life. Like, I think we commonly forget or take it for granted that we only have one precious, precious life, unless, we believe in incarnation. But so far, there's no empirical evidence of it. So I don't think these reasons are valid. And okay, to provide a little bit more color and perspective to my approach, I want to say something about my upbringing. Look how frozen that ice is. This is my first true Canadian winter. Crazy. Okay, I won't reiterate my full upbringing, but basically I was a refugee. We had to start from bare bones and live below our means in Canada. And before that, I had a much more poignant experience of poverty, very poignant. I won't go into details. I talk about it a little bit in the article. And then also my work experience is also very diverse. My first job out of high school was a minimum wage retail job, and then after that, warehouse and all these things up to my cushy corporate gig at the tech company. So I have the full spectrum of things in view. I don't just talk from a place of privilege when I say all these things. I have considered all these points. I think that I understand necessity and money better than anyone. Okay, I guess quickly, I don't think money could be your ultimate justification for work. It's way too shallow, and money is merely a means. Money is merely a medium of exchange to buy goods and services. It doesn't have magical powers. It can't buy you happiness or fulfillment. Oftentimes, the things we give up in order to earn money, like our autonomy, perhaps our morality, our freedom, those are things which are of infinite more value than any quantity that money can capture. Yeah, I think it's stupid to make the objective of work money. Like I said, it's a very crude thing. Furthermore, if you follow money to its conclusion, look at the wealthiest and most rich people in the world, they live extremely miserable, hollow lives. So I think that money is not a good reason for working. The second reason people commonly give for labor is labor they don't like doing necessarily, is that it's out of necessity. We have to work to feed ourselves. But I think this is no longer a valid argument in contemporary life. If you don't have a direct experience of poverty or necessity yourself, you can read novels like Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky or A Fine Balance by Rohinton Maestri, and there you really see what it's like to work and live for meeting the bare necessities of carrying life on. At least for myself, I find it incredibly intellectually dishonest to say that I would have to work for necessity. It's just simply not true. Furthermore, oftentimes when people talk about necessity, they're not really talking about necessity. What they're often talking about is their insatiable desire for materialism, extravagance, a certain lifestyle, keeping up with the Joneses, etc. They feel the sense of entitlement to have the best things in life. Rather, I shouldn't say the best things in life, the most superfluous things in life. I think most necessities can be eliminated by a simple inward reflection, a change of values, and the adoption of a simpler lifestyle. As Thoreau said, the wisest ever in the world, the Hindus, Greeks, Persians, etc., there was none poorer in outward appearances, but richer in inward. Furthermore, even if I were to concede that there is some necessity to working just for the mere sake of like wages, it still doesn't constitute trading one's entire life away for it. I think necessity should be subjected to necessity. And you know, many of the great thinkers like Thoreau and Spinoza, like they did labor. Like Spinoza grinded lenses and Thoreau did wage labor to meet their basic necessities. But the bulk of their work, the meat of their life, was still spent on their writing, you know, their self-ascribed work that gave them purpose and meaning. So I think that in contemporary life, I think in this Western safe society I live in now, where like healthcare and basic needs are met and there's safety and all these liberties, necessity is no longer a valid excuse for labor. And then one of the last reasons for work, we are told, is working for future payoff. This is usually in the form of retirement, you know, not being subjugated to work. We work so that we don't have to work anymore, which is a real catch-22. I think there's many illusions rife with this reason as the necessity one. And it assumes a lot of like false things. Like for instance, our ability to predict the future. Like there could be war and pestilence and humanity could be wiped, or one can get disease themselves or be incapacitated somehow and not be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor they spend their entire life working for. It also assumes this utopia, this perfect utopia, where one really experiences the fragrance of life, you know? And it's just an illusion. Like, those things don't exist. I really believe the cliche that the best things in life are free. They're accessible in the present. I'm also reminded of a Thoreau quote. He said something about an Englishman who wanted to be a poet. So he goes to India to make a fortune first in order that he may live the lifestyle of a poet. And Thoreau's like, he should have gone up the garret at once, which is like a abysmal attic room, and started writing poetry. So I think this reason is also like an elaborate form of procrastination on. So by and large, I think that the argument that we work for a future payoff is also not valid, not rational. One thought to its conclusion. So in summary, I think these big three reasons are not valid reasons for working anymore in contemporary life, or at least they're not valid for me. I can imagine my life so simple that I have to work so little in trade of my free time and autonomy in order to meet the necessities of life, and otherwise live a simple life dedicating myself to something else. Which begs the question, if we don't have to work for these reasons, do we work at all? Like, is idleness and pleasure the ideal state for us to be in? Is this the goal of the human project? Like, is our utopia no longer being subjugated to any work, any effort? The wind is really starting to pick up at the best part of my speech. Okay, why is it that... Okay, what is work by definition? Money has become synonymous with work, but that's not the definition of work. It's not just wage labor. Work by definition is simply effort towards outcomes, like effort towards an outcome. You have an outcome, you put effort, that's work. You know, humans worked before the advent of capitalism. Like, the efforts we work towards were usually survival and reproduction, like continuing the life force. But not just humans, like essentially all life forces, all organisms are engaged in this phenomenon of putting effort towards some outcome. Like animals to get their next meal, plants to grow, bacteria to reproduce. I believe it can be said that everything in the known universe is engaged in some effortful activity towards some objective. Like, even things like matter, space, energy, I believe they're all active, right? They're engaging in something, or like their intention waiting to engage in something. So the reason I believe that humans work is not because they must, that it's out of necessity, And if it were not the case, that they would be in idleness and pleasure and having such a blast with the experience of life. I think that we work because it's in our nature to work. Also, we forget that idleness and pleasure, those are experiences most poignantly felt after the exertion of work, like of labor. And without the effort beforehand, those experiences quickly become hollow and meaningless, and we don't derive any pleasure from it. And any attempts to shortcut this natural process by, for instance, taking drugs to give elated states, like we see the side effects of that, which are horrendous. So an argument for hedonists is also simply that we work because we want to enjoy leisure and labor. So that's my first contention, that we work not because we have to, but because we must. So we can't get away from working. And remember, working is a very strict definition when I speak of it. And I don't speak of vocation or hobby, because what I am critiquing is what the meat of our life is spent in, which is work. So I want to use that word and not a substitute for it, because then people would continue working on the way they work right now. I think making a living, like work simply for wages, should be like the hobby or vocation of life. It should be pushed to a corner and reduced to like the smallest influence, while the majority of life is work spent on something much more meaningful, which we'll get to. How the heck do you pick that then? Okay, so that's the first point, that we have to work. So the second point is, to what outcomes do we labor for? Like in the past, the outcomes we labored for were the same as other organisms, essentially to survive and reproduce. We don't do that anymore. We've actually become totally indifferent to our outcomes. We actually preach separation of work and life, as if that's possible at all. We've essentially delegated the task of the outcome to another, to our boss, the company's shareholders, manager, etc. And this doesn't really work. And it doesn't work, and it's obvious in all the mental anguishes and unhappiness we experience as a society. And the reason for that is that the labor we used to do was necessary to sustain the life force itself, and labor no longer does that. And the reason it doesn't, it's not, again, because we have to labor in these ignoble ways, but because, this will be my second contention, despite the aspirations of the Enlightenment, people have not developed the ability to think for themselves, to define their own outcomes for work. I will say that the question of how to work, what outcomes you should strive for, is really a question of how to live. What is the meaning of life? And just like most people are more than happy to delegate that task to the priest, their religion, to give them the meaning of life, they're happy to delegate that task to their boss to tell them what outcomes they should work for. I think this is the crux of the issue. And I want to walk next to the water. It looks much cooler. Okay, and as Immanuel Kant said, to emerge from maturity requires the ability to think for yourself. So we have to graduate to a higher plane of intellectualism and think for ourselves and define our own outcomes for work, and not be dependent on circumstances and people and mental gymnastics to argue that it's not our fault and we have to labor in these dreadful ways because of these reasons, because it doesn't work. It's evident in the existential and nihilistic dread we live in. Because if it was self-evident that the reason we labored for was because we must, then we would be happy knowing that the thing we are doing is sustaining the life force itself. Okay, I'm going to skip over some parts. So I think you buy my arguments so far, or you followed along my arguments so far. This was not a good day to wear runners. You can still tell I'm from the West Coast. Okay, I'm gonna finish my little essay really quickly because I'm getting cold, it's getting dark, and my hands are freezing, and I feel awkward holding my camera for so long. Okay, so I said money, need, future payoff are no longer good reasons for working. I said work is essential to our organism, to our life force. Without it, we would quickly decay and become dead. So we must work, but the defining question we have is to what outcomes? Before, the outcomes were simply survival and reproduction. And what is the 21st century version of that? What keeps the human spirit and life force vibrant these days? Okay, here's my proposal. I think it's 3 things. 1, I think our work has to do some good. 2, it has to be a vehicle for transformation and a place that cultivates our virtues. And 3, it should bring us to the present. That means it can't be a means to an end. The do good part, I say because it's just so self-evident in all the people that spend their lives in ways that made them happy at the end, that they did work until their last dying breaths. And the nature of that work is commonly that it does something good for others. Like, others is not necessarily for people in self-sacrificial. It can be for people, but it could also be for nature or ideals and concepts like the truth or justice. So people like Orwell, he finished 1984 in his deathbed because he knew that his work, like his writings warning about totalitarianism, authoritarianism, would do some good to future generations. I think when we engage in work that transcends our basic, like, selfish needs, we're able to, like, almost participate in something that is more divine or eternal than our bodily flesh. And for whatever reason, like, maybe that's a topic for another discussion, this is really gratifying for us. I think work needs to meet this criteria. It needs to do some good beyond the self. Second is basically can be summarized by Joseph Campbell, Hero's Journey. Work is naturally the arena that makes most sense to undergo transformations. All across myths and human cultures, people are captivated by the experience of transforming and becoming a better version of themselves. Work fits the structure. You know, we labor, we go through trials and tribulations for some outcome. And we usually select outcomes that are ambitious, reflecting our innate understanding that overcoming those challenges is the real boon, and not necessarily the specific outcome we reach. And then lastly, work cannot be a means to an end. It has to be the end itself. It should bring one increasingly to the present. Work should not be done in vain or filled with regrets as is commonly with people who selected absent-mindedly. I think that work that fits those 3 criteria is work that is chosen well in the context of a good life. So this analysis and conclusions I've come to have finally given me the clarity and comprehension to understand my actions and decisions and feelings. I know that for me to be happy, I must have the courage, more than anything, and clarity to find my own outcomes for work. So that's my central task. I know there's no other way. And I'm also reminded of a Abraham Maslow quote here. Abraham Maslow, who said, to know what one really wants is not easy. It's an incredible psychological achievement. So yeah, I was like procrastinating, backing up the words I wrote, but I finally did it, and it feels a little bit liberating. And another thing about necessity, there's another thorough quote that goes, people are determined to be starved before they are hungry. They say a stitch in time saves 9. So they take 1,000 stitches today to save 9 tomorrow. So I won't be making the same mistake whenever I do have to work to meet my basic needs. I will address the problem. And when I do, it will just be the hobby of my life and not the meat of it. And the meat of it will be spent on something far more noble. Okay, that's the conclusion of my video. Bye.